Good evening and a warm welcome to Galloway Hoard, a decade of discovery. My name's Sally Magnuson and it's wonderful to share this event with you. It's the third time we've looked at the Galloway Hoard in events like this. And I just get more and more enthused by everything that we're learning from it. As I've mentioned in the past, I grew up with the Vikings in a manner of speaking. My father, Magnus Magnusson, was an Icelander born and bred who translated several of the medieval Icelandic sagas from Old Norse into English and also wrote a great deal about the Viking Age. He made sure that I saw the Vikings as traders, master metalworkers, intrepid explorers, rather than merely the bloodthirsty assassins of popular repute. So the rediscovery of Viking Age Scotland and all we're going to learn in the next hour is a great delight to me, as it would have been indeed to him. Now, let me just set the context here, and it really is a very exciting one. The Galloway Hoard is one of the most important UK archaeological finds of the 21st century. No ifs, no buts. Buried around the year 900 AD in Dumfries and Galloway, the hoard lay undisturbed for more than 1,000 years before being unearthed by a metal detectorist in September 2014. In 2017, it was allocated to National Museum Scotland after a successful fundraising campaign supported by the National Heritage Memorial Fund and Art Fund Saved It for the Nation. The Galloway Hoard was hailed as a remarkable Viking Age treasure, and over the 10 years since its discovery, it's been analysed by experts, yielding up layer upon layer of historical insights. We're going to hear from some of those experts tonight. They'll discuss these insights and share a vision for the future of the hoard. But first, let's look back at the first of many discoveries, the day the hoard was excavated. Let's hear from Andrew Nicholson, the council archaeologist for Dumfries and Galloway Council.
My name is Andrew Nicholson. I'm the council archaeologist for Dumfries and Galloway Council. I first came up to Galloway in 1986 to work on the excavations at Whitthorn on what was described as the largest Viking town excavated on mainland Scotland. I ran my own archaeology company after the Whitthorn excavation finished, and in 1999 I started work for the council. I was the archaeologist who went out and excavated the hoard. It was Monday morning. We had a mid-morning phone call from the Treasure Trove unit who said that they had received a call that a Viking hoard had been discovered in a field in Galloway. So it was arranged that I could gather my digging kit together and head out into a field to see what it was all about. We knew that the church, the parish church for Balmagee, was dedicated to St Andrew, and our earliest records of it show that it belonged to the Priorate Iona, which is unusual within the region. Current church is 18th century, but the remnants of the medieval church are still visible within the churchyard. We knew that in the particular field it came from, we knew that there were two enclosures, undated, one with a curvilinear boundary, the other with very straight line boundary with a very angular corner. We just got a partial image of that on aerial photographs, but they're undated. They could be prehistoric, they could have been medieval. So we actually knew very little about that particular area. And certainly in terms of something that was Viking era, it's absolutely off our radar. And having photographed the scene as I got there, I completely stunned the detectorists by putting a layer of sheeting in and filling their hole in with the hoard. But that's because as an archaeologist, what I need to understand is the context. Is it buried in a pit? What sort of deposits are there? Is there a feature within which it's contained? So I filled in their hole and opened up a larger area and cleaned that down until I could see the edge of a pit, and I could see that the hoard had been buried up against one edge of the pit. Once I'd cleaned and uncovered the hoard down, I did all the recording, planned it, photographed it. I'd arrived there early in the afternoon. we know that the sun sets at 7. I've got plenty of time to get on with this. So we record each individual piece as it comes out. It was shortly before 5 when we finished the first hoard because we'd done it really carefully. And we ran the detector over the base of the pit to make sure. I'd reached a fine gravel there and he got a ping of a signal, which really surprised us because as an archaeologist, it looked to me like natural soil. And in the end, we took up about 8 centimeters of gravel and I came across a glint of silver, which turned out to be the base of the decorated silver vessel. We discovered that there's another parcel containing a group of circular arm rings with material inside it and a second stash of arm rings and ingots laid out, clearly like the upper hoard, all laid out in pretty much the same direction and presumably packaged similarly. By this stage, I was already well aware that this was the largest Viking era hoard found in Scotland since the scale hoard in the middle of the 19th century. And what we didn't want to do was come back the next morning to find a hole where the second largest Viking era hoard in Scotland had been. So we went ahead and excavated it. We are seen in modern terms as remote, but Galloway is a maritime province. It's always been a maritime province. And through my 15 years of working at Whithorn and writing up a load of the finds from that site, we were already aware, certainly of trade within the Irish Sea Zone. We've got coins from Chester, coins from Dublin. Whithorn has produced a whole load of Irish style pins and other objects that show that there's a maritime connection. We've got soapstone bowls, which shows that there's a trade route running up to the north of Scotland or to Orkney and Shetland. So we were aware that Galloway was already tied in to the Scandinavian maritime commercial network. But the Galloway Hoard, with its significant number of really exotic objects, just shows how widely these connections actually spread out. What the Galloway Hoard shows is that this internationalism continues right the way through into the medieval period. And I think one of the important things of the hoard is it reconnects Galloway with its maritime past. The fact that I'm an early medievalist and I recognize the significance of the individual artifacts and the collection as I was uncovering more of it, simply added to that feeling that it's. I mean, people say it's a once in a lifetime, but actually, it is the largest hoard of its kind in Scotland since the scale hoard. That's 160 years. It's not once in a lifetime. It's genuinely a once in a century find. So the fact that there are researchers producing new papers, giving out new public lectures and so on that reveal more is for me the really fascinating part of it. It's genuinely the hoard that keeps giving. We are 10 years in and we're still scratching the surface. We're still learning new material. And to have been a part and to have helped initiate that process is very gratifying.
Andrew Nicholson there, what a thrill that must have been, seeing that glint of silver and just realizing the magnitude of the discovery that had been made there. And here we are now, 10 years on. So what have we learned since the discovery of the hoard? Well, thanks to a major grant from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, our understanding of the hoard has made immense leaps forward. This grant has funded the Unwrapping the Galloway Hoard project, a research partnership led by Dr. Martin Goldberg, Principal Curator of Medieval Archaeology and History at National Museum Scotland, and Dr. Susanna Harris, Senior Lecturer in Archaeology at the University of Glasgow. Over the last 3 years, this project has given us unprecedented insights into the objects within the hoard, as well as the bigger questions about how and why people assembled hoards like these in the past. Well, 3 research assistants have been working on this project. Here they are using their unique skills to address these questions. So let me just start by asking you all to introduce yourselves. Adrian first.
Hi, thanks, Sally. I'm Adrian Maldonado. I'm Galloway Hoard researcher at National Museum Scotland. I've done a lot of work at the museum on their Viking and early medieval collections. And my role in the project, amongst other things, is cataloging and writing up the brilliant hack silver and bullion objects from the hoard and investigating the wider Viking Age context of hoarding.
Thank you, Mary.
Hello, I'm Mary Davis, and I'm also a researcher on the Galloway Hoard at the National Museums of Scotland. I'm a conservator, but I also specialise in the study of inorganic artefacts, and I've been exploring how the technical and elemental analysis of objects can help us understand the hoard and the people behind it.
And Alex, finally.
Hi everyone, I'm Alexandra Makin and I'm a professional embroiderer and textile archaeologist specialising in the early medieval period. I held the role of a postdoctoral research assistant for the Unwrapping the Galloway Hoard project. My focus was looking at the textiles and the leather, including a little bit of stitching that was found, and exploring these in their wider early medieval context.
Well, we'll hear more from you, Alex, and from Mary in just a moment. But first of all, Adrian, take us back to how and why the hoard came to National Museum Scotland.
Absolutely. Well, we always tell people that the Galloway Hoard is almost one of these best case scenarios of responsible metal detecting. So on the day of discovery, like you just heard, the metal detectors did the right thing by stopping what they were doing once they realized that they discovered something important and reporting their find to the Treasure Trove Unit in Scotland, who act on behalf of the Crown. This meant that an archaeologist was able to come out that very day and assist in the recovery and recording the find properly. It also meant that that additional investigation of the site could happen immediately and inform what happened next. There was initial conservation done by a commercial unit, AOC Archaeology, and this included securing laboratory investigation and stabilization of all the finds, including the vessel wrapped in all of its textiles. At that point, some of you might be familiar with the process, but for those of you who aren't, very briefly, what happens when you report a find to Treasure Trove and they deem it is of a sort of significance, it then goes before a panel of independent experts called the Scottish Archaeological Finds Allocation Panel. They act on behalf of the King's and Lords Treasurer's Remembrancer, and they determine the valuation of the objects. And what people don't know is that this takes a lot of factors into account. Sure, the amount of gold and silver is a big part of it. The sort of the market value of precious metals is part of it, but also the condition of the find and whether we know that it is a complete find. And having an archaeologist come out and record these things ensures that we've got the integrity of this find, and the panel takes that into account. Reporting things quickly is another thing that affects how much the panel is secure that this is the complete find, that it hasn't been messed about with, that nothing is sort of missing within reason. Okay, so all of that affects the valuation, and the panel is what kind of decides that based on the objects in there, but also their cultural significance.
I just want a brief word on what you think the benefits have been of the hoard being allocated eventually to National Museum Scotland.
Oh, I mean, the benefits are numerous. So once the panel sort of assigns a value, in this case, it was a value of 1.98 million, which is an extraordinary amount for archaeological finds. You know, there's only very few institutions that have the means and capability to do the kind of outreach that it needs to sort of do the major fundraising campaign that in the end the NMS were able to hold. And hundreds and I think thousands of individual small donations later, as well as the big funding bodies that you mentioned already, Sally, the Art Fund and the National Heritage Memorial Fund, the hoard was able to be saved for the nation. The value of having it at the National Museum is cutting edge laboratory facilities, a global network of experts. Basically, if we don't know how to do it, we know who to call to give us advice and lend us a hand.
Well, talking of experts, we're going to take a closer look now at Mary's extensive conservation and analysis of the remarkable variety of materials in the hoard. Mary's recorded a presentation to give us a sense of the discoveries she's made in her time working on the hoard.
Well, hello, and thank you, Sally, for that introduction. I'm going to talk about one aspect of the hoard, mainly the vessel, but I just wanted to put it in its context briefly before I start talking about it in more detail. So when it was buried in the ground, there was an upper layer, which consisted mostly of Viking arm rings and bullion, and a silver pectoral cross. And then there was a lower level, which had twice as much silver bullion in the form of arm rings and ingots, a cluster of arm rings with some gold, and this lidded vessel, which formed the third element of the hoard. And here you can see it in the ground before it was taken out. And here is your silver bullion, and here are your arm rings. And this is the vessel which was lying upside down in the ground with its lid on and wrapped in textiles. And the position of it in the ground is really important for the preservation of the materials inside, because it stopped the ingress of water and air to a large extent, which is very important for the later preservation of what we've got. So just to show you schematically what was in the vessel, it was packed full of objects of all different materials. The vessel itself is only about 10 centimetres high and about 10 centimetres wide, so you can see how carefully it had to be put together to fit all these objects in. And this hoard within a hoard, if you like, is really different from the rest of the hoard. It's not made up of classic Viking warrior bullion. It's made up of much more personal objects, and they're much more geographically and chronologically dispersed. So the vessel itself is incredibly important. It was wrapped in a layer of linen, which had another layer of wool overlying this. And as you can see from this image, it's very corroded with green corrosion, but that's overlying a delicately decorated silver gilt vessel. And we could see the decoration because we had a scan done at the British Museum. The decoration on this vessel suggests it's not from Britain or even from continental Europe, but probably from the Middle East, which makes it very special in its own way and very different from other objects in the hoard. So if we look at what was actually in the vessel and go down through it, I'm going to talk first about the top layer, which was what was above this line, and you can just see in this early photograph here. And these are the objects as they were cleaned and conserved. They're mostly made of glass, not materials that you would expect to be particularly valuable. And if we look at this object here, this gives you an indication of the type of object we've got. It's not a man-made object, but a natural stone that occurs, which is a sort of roundish flint nodule, which has developed a hole in it. And as water's ingressed in geological time, it's dissolved some of the inside, but left a core of material. And this core actually rattles within the stone. These stones are quite special, we know, from literature in the Near East and in the Roman times with Pliny the Elder and in medieval period. And they're known as rattlestones, and they're particularly associated with pregnancy and with childbirth because of their quality of having something inside, I guess. And so we don't know the age of this, but we know that it's probably got very strong female associations. It's not valuable in monetary terms, but it might have been very valuable as an amulet. You can see here 2 very battered looking brownish glass beads. and they probably date from the 5th or 6th century, so several hundred years old when they were buried. And they might well have come from continental Europe as well, and not from Britain. We can see that they're quite battered, they have lots of marks on them, and that's because of their age, not because of the burial in the ground. They've been used, they've been worn, and they've been handled. Up here we have a rock crystal sphere that's been wrapped in a silver frame. And the silver frame is broken on one of these pieces. It's missing its hook. So again, a very old and used and handled object. But they are found in Anglo-Saxon and in Merovingian graves, and again, strongly associated with women of childbearing age. So we have a strong female connection coming out here. And to give you some idea of the heirloom quality of these objects, this is a slightly later bead, probably was made in England, but it was broken. And when it was broken, it was put into this silver case and made into a pendant. And part of the pendant had a pierced coin at the top. The coin is dated to Cernwulf of Mercia, who died in 821. So if we think that the hoard was buried around 900, we're already talking about 2 or 3 generations earlier when this case was made, and maybe 2 or 3 generations earlier than that the bead was made. So you can see a family history of care, of collecting, of curating, of understanding your predecessors and your ancestors, going back beyond living memory, which makes this a very important group of objects. We also think, from Martin McSweeney's photograph, that these objects were probably all wrapped together in some textile. There were the remains of textiles here and remains of braids that were threaded through some of the objects. So this special group was put together in a pouch and put into the top of the vessel. So below this, we start to see something else happening. There's one of the bundles in preserved textiles that we can see here. And then there's a group of brooches, 2 stacked here, 4 stacked here, and 1 here, and a gold ingot. So you can see how tightly it was all packed. The brooches are quite spectacular, and they are made of precious metal, and they do look amazing. They're probably not far off contemporary with the burial of the hoard. They're late Anglo-Saxon in character. And although they look like they form 3 pairs and a singleton, the pairs are interesting. They're not obviously pairs when you look closer. This one is very finely made compared to this one. And then this larger brooch has a huge history of replacement and repairs of pieces, but it's been repaired to the extent it could still be worn. So this is the bundle you can see next to the brooches. And although archaeological textiles don't look spectacular, they really are, because they're very rarely preserved. And when they are, we can take an awful lot of information from them. And we know that this was a very soft leather exterior, which was lined with very, very finely woven silk samite, which would have come from possibly Byzantium or possibly further east along the Silk Road, but very valuable materials in their own right. And then also wrapped in linen inside this pouch was this rock crystal jar. And the rock crystal jar itself has this deep history within it. The rock crystal, we think, probably came from Rome and was quite an old object that's then been repurposed to make it into this vessel by wrapping it with gold. It might well have been some sort of reliquary. And on the bottom, in gold filigree, it has an inscription saying, Higwold, Bishop Higwold had me made. So we have a named object, again, a very personal item, wrapped in this sumptuous material and buried in the hoard. So going down from that bundle, we come to another bundle here, which we've named as the silk braid bundle because of all these silk braids that are in it. And just to give you a sense of scale, this braid across here is about 2 millimeters. And below that bundle, we come to a final group of objects, a black stone pendant, some double braids with gold embroidery, these very strange hinge straps, they're again late Anglo-Saxon, and 2 small balls of dirt, which have been buried right in the bottom amongst all this valuable material. So to go back a bit to the silk braid bundle and seeing how we can try and work out what was going on, you can see from this early photograph there are some gold objects and lots of braids, and an X-ray gives us even more detail. Here are the gold objects, very dense in the X-ray. And there's a gold ring that's on the inside of the bundle, so completely hidden from view. Here's some of the double braided embroidery. And this gives us an idea of what was actually going on inside. But the textile bundle itself was very partial. We only really had the top of it. It was made of a finer weave textile here, the more open weave textile here. And the braids that you could see coming out from the gold ring in the X-ray are coming out there, and the gold ring is under there. So when these mounts were taken out, you could see these spectacular little animal heads, all socketed. And to give you an idea of size, this is about 4 centimetres long, so about 2.5 centimetres with the animal head itself. They looked like they were covered in dirt, but there wasn't really any dirt in the vessel because it was sort of sealed. So what this shows you is just how vulnerable and rare textile survival is, because this supposed dirt is actually lots of minute fibres of the silk braids that have just disintegrated onto the surface. So we're lucky to have any surviving. But what we do have surviving in every single socket is some of the silk braids. So we know that these were threaded through. They were pinned at the end of here and threaded diagonally through there. We can also see some of the craftsmanship. This little pin at the end of the socket is about 1 millimetre in diameter, holding the braid in. You'll see the decoration of gold filigree, twisted wire, the sockets made for the eyes, and the just general craftsmanship. These really tiny but really brilliant little objects. And in an X-ray that you can see from when they were in the bundle together, you can see that the long sockets are drawn up to the front 2 sockets of the squatter beast here, similarly to this. And if we think about how it was threaded with the braids, we probably end up with something like this. We don't know how long the braids are because so much of it has disintegrated, but we do know that it probably formed a sort of cinch which could be tightened, and these 2 pieces could dangle down. Now, below this bundle was this black stone, and the black stone had no textile on the upper surface, but on the lower surface it was covered in textile, and on the sides. And although it's very degraded, which you can see here, it actually matches the same textile that was in the bundle. So what's happened and why our bundle was so partial and only had the top remaining was this quite heavy stone pendant has fallen through and landed outside, but was originally part of the same group of objects. And we can see that from this X-ray. You can see here the socketed mounts, and here's the stone pendant. And there's some of the embroidered braid going up alongside it. And there's the gold ring that was inside the bundle, but we couldn't see from the outside. And here it is with some of the braids going through. And if we look at the bundle upside down, you can see the ring at the top, and you can see this marked area that's been flattened. And that's been flattened because it fits exactly with the black stone pendant. So we now know that all these objects were buried together. And there was a bit of silk braid that also went through the hole in the pendant. And if we look further at this black stone, you can see little gold specks going across the surface there. And if we look under higher magnification in the scanning electron microscope, which can also look at elemental analysis, we can see that these gold dots do actually form a streak of gold that goes across the surface. So we think that this was probably a touchstone, which was originally made to assay or to assess the type of gold and the quality of the gold that was used. But again, it has a quality of a relic or an heirloom or something special that's been kept. And we don't know how all these objects were strung together. This is one possibility. Could have been strung from a belt. We know that those socketed mounts were joined like that. They could have been wrapping up another bundle, or they could have been part of a headdress or a veil. There isn't any direct parallels, though I think the headdress and veil are probably the most likely the context we have at the moment. But just to show you again the variety of objects in here, going from the really mundane glass of little value to gold and rock crystal, and all with personal histories and a lot with female associations are very different to what we normally think of as a Viking Age hoard.
It's absolutely stunning, Mary. You know, the intimacy of the things inside that vessel, it's so striking. The idea, you know, the idea that these beads have been, for instance, been cared for by families and restored and passed on down through the generations. I mean, it's really quite moving. Who do you think is behind it?
Well, it's difficult to know, but I think it's an exceptional glimpse at much more familial history than we normally see. Something much more on a domestic sphere, looking at how your family goes back, you know, hundreds of years and maybe hundreds of miles away, and retold through objects, through an oral history. Maybe the objects had a mnemonic purpose in sort of reminding you of the stories of your forebears. And I think, you know, the very feminine aspect and the very domestic aspect is not something we normally see, because the written material is often about wars, kings, treaties, and this is something very different and much more sort of much more personal. So I think it probably was, you know, a very personal family history, family treasure.
Well, let's take a couple of the questions that are coming in. How likely is it, someone asked, that we'd be able to figure out where the soil comes from in the soil balls?
There are possibilities. I mean, it's very tricky because soil is so ubiquitous, but there are clues in soils that, and more science all the time is helping us decide things. So there might be pollen grains that could help. There might be other residues. There are little bits of twigs and things in there. The trouble is that by looking at this thing, you have to take samples and then you destroy the tiny objects to some level. So we haven't looked at that in detail yet, but it's certainly something in our minds, and we would really like, obviously, to find out more about it. We think they quite possibly came from the Holy Land as contact relics, so that might give us a place to start. But it is a bit like looking for a needle in a haystack when you're looking for a soil sort of sample. Yeah.
Pat asks, are there animals? Pat suggests leopards in the decoration of the vessel.
Well, the decoration, the animals on it seem to have spots and stripes, and although they're slightly abstract in form, I think they do represent leopards and tigers, which apparently are quite common in Sasanian imagery. So that's another thing that points the vessel towards an Iranian origin. Yeah.
And Todd asks if you've managed to find any historical record for Bishop Hygwald.
That's a difficult one. We believe it's a Northumbrian name, and it has been recorded in Northumbrian records, but there's no actual Bishop Hygwald that we know of. And we don't have all the names of all the bishops from the Northumbrian bishoprics. So we're pretty certain it's a Northumbrian bishop, but we can't pin it down.
Well, you've been given quite difficult ones there, Mary.
Yeah.
Let me give you a more speculative one. Do you think that this was intended to be left in the ground for 1,000 years, or did the people who buried it mean to come back? I mean, it's presumably one can't know, but what's your best guess?
It's difficult to get into the mindset of somebody 1,000 years ago, but I think it's so personal. It's such a treasure of your family. I would have thought that they did mean to recover it, because it tells you such a lot about your own personal history and ancestry, that you would it'd be something you'd want to keep, I think. And I think it was probably in the ground for safekeeping to be recovered, but that's just a personal feeling.
Well, thanks very much, Mary, and thank you for these questions. Keep them coming, everybody. We're going to take a look now at Alex's research into the leather, linen, silk and wool inside the hoard. She's done us a marvellous presentation too. Here it is.
So now we're going to look at the textiles within the hoard in a little more detail. And I suppose the first question that we would ask is how many individual distinct textiles were there or are there in the hoard? And this is a difficult question in some respects. Well, it was at the beginning of the project because a lot of the textiles, when we looked inside the vessel, were very fragmented, and it looked like there were tens and tens of different types of fabrics in there. But actually, over the course of the project, and as the team has done the analysis, we realised that there were 7 or 8 textiles, the leather, and 5 braids and plaits within this part of the hoard. Oh, and I must say that some of the braids are actually stitched with gold embroidery thread. And as a professional embroiderer, I found that really exciting. The next question is obviously, what were these textiles used for? And this is an easier one to answer. They were used as wrappers, they were used as protection. And you can see here with the example of the rock crystal bundle that we had 3 different types of wrappers. The colour schematic that you can see here is what textile archaeologists use to demonstrate these different layering of textiles within archaeological context. So in this one, we have the brown, which is the leather, the purple, which is the silk, and the green, which is the bast fibre textile. And I'll talk about these in a bit more detail later on. What were the braids and plaits used for? Well, the braids were used for linking objects together, keeping them as one bundle in this instance. And the plaits were used to tie the textiles together to hold them, wrapping and protecting the vessel and its lid. These you might not be able to make out these braids because they're very ethereal, but they are there, trust me. So if we look at the socketed mount bundle in a bit more detail, we can see that there are 2 bast fibre, that's plant, probably flax, textiles. So this is a linen textile. Both are what we call plain weave, and you'll sometimes see this as called tabby weave as well. And you can see a diagram of that in the slide. The textile on the right of the image has Z spun yarn in one system and S spun yarn in the second system. And we're calling this systems because we don't know which was the warp and which was the weft, the vertical and horizontal thread. Z spun means that when you look at the yarn, the twist of it follows the same direction as the central bar of a Z. And S spun means that the twist, the turning of the yarn, follows the central bar of the letter S. So this is what we mean when we say Z and S spun. This type of linen, bast fibre textile with Z and S spun yarn is not very common in the early medieval period. The fabric on the left uses Z spun yarn in both systems, and this is much more common in the period. So bast fibre textiles were used for most of early medieval society, not necessarily all of it, and throughout the period. And although they were not as ubiquitous as wool because of the costs involved, both human and economic, you had to grow the plant, process it, and then turn it into a textile. However, surviving evidence shows that it was used for lots of different things, including clothing, wrappers, and the background for embroideries, etc. While bast fibre textiles made from Z spun yarn in both systems were, as I said, common in the period, the use of the S and Z spun is unusual, with only a couple of examples being found. So that makes these textiles quite exciting. If we look at the braids from this bundle, we can see that they are what's called 6-strand braids. And samples of these were sent off to Ina van den Berg in Brussels, and she tested them for dye because, although you can't see it here in the image necessarily, when you look at them visually, some of the yarn looks green-black, while other threads within the braid look more brown-red. And the results show that they are both dyed with a mixture of dyer's madder and indigo or woad, but in different ratios, and that's how we get these different colour tones showing through on the braid. And I've put an image of the gold embroidery for you there because I just think it's so beautiful. We have very few braids surviving from the period, so we don't know if this biochrome and the use of stitching two braids together and then covering it with embroidery was common. And this is one of the other things that makes the hoard really exciting. So if we now move on to the rock crystal bundle, we can see that the rock crystal itself was wrapped in that bast fibre textile, and that had Z spun threads in both directions. All of that was then put into a pouch, which was made of leather and lined with a weft-based compound twill, a samite silk. And the technical characteristics of this twill tell us that it was probably woven in eastern Iran, Syria, or Central Asia during the 8th to 9th centuries. This is a small piece of textile, but when it was made, it would have been much, much bigger. But as it's travelled from east to west, connecting people through trade and exchange and gift networks, it was cut down and pieces were handed out, physically connecting those people through this particular textile. So if we now move on to the vessel and lid, this was wrapped in those two layers of fabric. The outer layer is wool, which is a plain tabby weave, and this is woven with S-spun threads in one system and Z-spun in the second. This is a fairly unusual type of wool textile. This is also an heirloom textile because radiocarbon dating has dated it to about 100 years before the hoard was buried. So the combination of its weave structure, the yarns that we use, and its date make this an uncommon, as far as we're aware, textile. And other examples that date to the same period have been found along the east coast of England and in some early medieval trade centres such as Southampton. There's not many finds as well. So again, another really important textile. And I just want to highlight that the microscopic image, I've lightened that a little bit so you're able to see the details more clearly. The inner fabric, the inner layer is that bast fibre textile. This is woven in plain weave, but it's unusual. They're all unusual because it's what we call a spin patterned textile. And as you can see from the image, it has four Z spun yarns and then 4 S spun yarns. And this carries along in both warp and weft systems, system 1 and system 2. That is unusual because while we have found a very small number of spin pattern textiles from the early medieval Britain and Ireland and across the continent, none have been identified as having the same spin pattern as this. So our bast fibre textile is also even more interesting because it has the relationship with the wool. All the other examples have been found wrapping objects or birds or parts of bags and liners, but they're individual. They don't have that extra layer. So this may have added extra meaning and connotations to wrapping of the vessel. It could be significant that the linen, with its idea of purity and holiness, was used as the inner wrapping next to that very precious vessel, which was an exotic item, while the more mundane wool, while still being rare within the idea of wool cloths, didn't have the same meanings associated with it. And it's the wool that forms that barrier between the objects and the precious objects and the ground in which they were buried. So in conclusion, we can say that while all these textiles were precious in their own way, we can see that they form what we can call cloth cultures as discrete wrappers of objects and bundles, and as a group of textiles within the hoard, and as objects within their own right within early medieval society. The wool was an heirloom with multiple stories from generations and use, and its rare weave shows that it had travelled far within the early medieval Britain. The linen textiles sit within a long tradition of wrapping objects for burial, and their unique properties within early medieval cultures gave them power across faiths, which recognised their associations with purity, and this made them ideal wrappers for precious objects. And by the time the silk textile arrived in early medieval England, only ecclesiastical or secular elites had access to them. Within religious settings, they took on many layers of meaning, linking church to heaven. And within secular circles, they demonstrated power and far-reaching connections. It may be that the general population of early medieval England only knew them from this context and didn't necessarily know their stories linking them back to the East. But finally, all were used as wrappers. All share the culture of protecting objects considered precious, valuable heirlooms, significant and powerful in their own right. Their relationships to each other brought together over and through time both became shared remembering and wrapping, containing the object's significances and hiding them from prying eyes, while imbuing them with cultural meanings. Linen, pure enough for the holy, and a connection to liminal space between earth and heaven. Wool, the protector and covering for all of society, incorporating time and space. And silk, the jewel that encompassed far-off cultures and faiths, the morphing and meaning through time and use. However, in the hoard, all the textiles became equal when they were incorporated into it, and thus their fundamental meanings were changed and shared. They created their own cloth culture that was understood by those who buried them within the hoard, and it was for us to unravel and find today.
Alex, thank you so much for that. You were talking there about the thrill of seeing that lovely gold thread, and that's because you're a professional embroiderer yourself as well as a researcher. Can you tell us just a bit more about how that personal professional experience informs your approach to the textiles in the hoard?
Yes. Well, first of all, it makes me very giddy about things, especially when we find any embroidery or even functional, what we would call functional stitching, tailoring and things like that. But then for me personally, it's about the fact that I can see the human touch inside that work. And depending on how fine the embroidery is, how neat it tells me about the skill set of those embroiderers and gives me a glimpse into the way they're working, their training and their mind. And I just find that sort of thing really fascinating.
Following on from what Mary's work has revealed, who do you think owned the objects in the lidded vessel, and how did they value the textiles inside it?
I would have to agree with Mary that I think that there's that very strong familial message coming through with the objects and the textiles, and that female side is also telling a story as well, I think, particularly with the textiles, because during this part of the period, textiles, weaving, the production of yarn through spinning was a female occupation, as well as things like embroidery and decorating ground fabric and things like that. So for me, as an embroiderer, but as a researcher, I can see that female link and those stories coming through. So I would have to agree with what Mary said on that point.
And a last quick one to you from Angela. I wondered about this as well. How would they make the gold thread?
So this particular gold thread is unusual for the period, as the whole hoard is unusual for the period. So normally you would have a thread, and you would have what we call a core, and most of the time, in fact, 99.9% of the finds from the early medieval period, the core is a silk, although in Marsyke, the core is horsehair, but that's very unusual. And you would then wrap thin strips of gold. So your gold would be hammered very thin and it would be cut into strips. And then these would be wrapped around your core threads to make your gold thread that you can use for embroidery. In the thread that was used in the Galloway Hoard, you have that, but then that has been wrapped around a second core to make that thicker looking gold thread that you see embroidered. So this is, it's unusual actually.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Adrian, you've been smiling and nodding throughout. I wonder how Alex's and Mary's research has helped you in understanding the entire hoard. You have this wonderful overview of the whole thing. Where does that fit in, the kind of minuscule detail we're getting from Alex and Mary?
My goodness. I mean, every day is a school day working with Alex and Mary. I've worked very closely with Mary over the last 3 years in particular, because we're in the same building a lot of the time. And I can't tell you all the things that I've learned just by just in chatting away. But I mean, I want to get to one of the things that she kind of ended on, that sort of personal connection and the fact that a lot of these objects belong to individuals. And we often forget that, we think this is, especially with the Viking Age, we think of loot and things being stolen or sort of hurriedly being put away. But the Galloway Hoard tells us something completely different. It speaks to things that were bundled and prepared with care and a lot of forethought, and so these things were put together on purpose. And the more you look outside of that lidded vessel, the more you see little traces of that, even amongst the piles of silver, which are so clearly just money and wealth. In the arm ring cluster of the hoard, there's this group of 3 gold objects, including that little iconic gold bird pin. That's the kind of thing that we only have like one other example of, anywhere, any parallel to it. And so whoever wore this, would have been associated with that pin. And anytime anybody saw that pin, if they saw that pin, without the person, they would immediately think of that person. They're that sort of specific and sort of one-offs in that way. And I think every object, any of those personal objects, links to a person, and it would have been known and recognized as being associated with that person. And there's bits of this all over the hoard. The pectoral cross, which still has its silver wire wrapped around it, like if it was worn yesterday. It's in the top of the hoard, the little gold bird pin, and all of the objects in that lidded vessel. They're associated with individual people and more than one person with the case of this hoard. There's a lot more that goes into this than just one Viking warlord or one king or one queen even.
Yeah, and do you have any thoughts on why it was hoarded, why it was buried? What the context of the circumstances might have been? Is that just pure speculation, or are there any clues?
Oh, there's loads of clues, and one of the biggest clues actually comes out of where the silver was actually obtained from, and lucky you, you can actually go and watch our previously recorded NMS event, which featured one of our expert colleagues, Dr. Jane Kershaw from the University of Oxford. She and her team undertook a lot of the scientific analysis, which tells us that the silver of the arm rings and the treasure outside of that lidded vessel were derived from Anglo-Saxon metalwork and Anglo-Saxon coinage. But the silver of that silver lidded vessel that contained all of these heirlooms and antiques is something completely different altogether. And now, because of her research, because of their research, we now have pinned down the origin of the silver of that vessel to what's now in modern day Iran. And so all of these different things, all the different sources of metal are giving us little clues as to where this bit of the hoard came from, which is different from where that bit of the hoard came from. And it's so much to chew on, but there's any number of stories about how all this stuff comes together in the deposit that we know now as the Galloway Hoard.
There's a question from Jules, who asks, does the lidded vessel have inlay? Is that one for you, Mary?
Yeah, it does. It has gilding on the surface, but it also has an inlay, a fine black inlay, which outlines some of the details of the animals. And this is made of niello, which is a silver sulfide compound, which could be heated and put into little recesses carved into the silver. So it highlights the silver with that metal color against the black. And it's used a lot for sort of, as I said, outlining the detail, but it's very carefully made and produced. Yeah.
Mary, there's new technology developing all the time. What do you think that the future might hold for the hoard in terms of research and analysis going forward?
I think probably quite a lot. I mean, we're doing what we can now with the resources and the people we know, but all the time, sample sizes that are needed to test things are getting smaller and the results are getting more sophisticated. And things like isotope analysis, which Jane Kershaw used for sourcing the silver, is also used for sourcing glass. And we're hoping in the future it might, with more data collected, it might help give us more information about gold, for instance. And then samples for things like DNA and radiocarbon dating are getting smaller and the data sets are getting more precise. So I think we're going to see more accurate information coming out of smaller and smaller bits of evidence in all our archaeological research. But I think this will refine what we know further in the future.
You mentioned glass there. Is there a way someone asked to tell where the glass comes from to make the beads?
There are lots of different bits of information you put together. So there's the elemental analysis and the proportions of different glass forming elements, such as the silica and soda, and you might be able to source those. There's also isotope analysis, which gives you an indication of where the sands that formed the glass might have derived from geologically. So there's becoming more and more information on this, and we think most of the glass in Galloway was probably made from sand from Egypt or the Levant, and from soda that came from evaporitic soda in the Nile Delta. So it's giving us an indication. So it probably came from the Eastern Mediterranean originally.
Well, Cara has asked, what are all your personal favorite objects, which is a great question. Alex, what's the object that has really piqued your interest and attention and thrill, maybe?
That's more difficult for me to answer than it should be, because I think everyone would expect me to say the gold embroidery, and yeah, that probably would top just. But all the different textiles have been interesting for various different reasons. And for example, it's that wider comparative research that I was doing for those, and the fact that these textiles turned out to be quite unique in their own ways, and there's and rare survivals, but with not much evidence. You had to really trawl through published and non-published and documentation and reports, which I like that sort of thing. So that was really cool. But it's the fact that you were able to uncover these possible stories and histories that extended beyond the objects themselves, that actually made them, all of them, really interesting in different ways. But from an embroidery perspective, it would have to be the gold embroidery. Yeah.
Mary, yours?
Well, I also find this really difficult. I mean, from a conservative perspective, I think cleaning the pectoral cross was the most amazing thing to do, revealing that decoration on something that we really haven't seen anything like before. But then more recently, say in the vessel, those little socketed mounts, the way we've sort of managed to say more about them, they've been found singly as metal detector finds, but nobody really knew what they were for. And they've never been found as a group. So to find them threaded with this braid and how they might have been put together, I think is a really good way of sort of enhancing our knowledge about that and looking at more stories about these objects and what they were for.
Thank you. And Adrian, as I come to you for your favorite object, I'll also just toss in a question that you can maybe answer at the same time. Is the deposition of artifacts in two distinctive burial layers, somebody asks, unusual? That would be interesting to know. And tell us your favorite item. And then I've got one last question for you before we unfortunately have to wrap up.
Well, I'll do the easy one first. How unusual is it? Very unusual to have this sort of layering. But now actually, one of the great things about the Galloway Hoard that always comes up is the more you find out about it, the more you look at all of the other hoards that we have in the museum and the British Museum and other museums that have these great Viking collections. You look at those hoards and you wonder, gosh, if we had metal detectors in 1860, maybe you could look a little further and find lower layers in a lot of other hoards as well. So frankly, we don't know what we don't know with regard to that. But the Galloway Hoard is one of these things that kind of brings these questions to light, even of older finds, well-known finds. To get to the hardest question of the night, what's your favorite object in the hoard? Impossible. It changes every day. But you know what? Let's go left field. There's arm rings with runic inscriptions in the lower part of the hoard, and they have little sort of cryptic notes, little words that could be abbreviated personal names. But there's one ring that has a much longer inscription, something like 10 or 11 characters. And we know that they're Anglo-Saxon runes like the other arm rings, but it's a much longer message. And it still hasn't been cracked. It hasn't been deciphered, and I think that sort of lingering mystery, we've got a good lead on what it might mean, but it's, it's still out for sort of peer review by the experts, but I think there's going to be different ways of reading that one. And so the kind of mystery goes on. So I think for now, I'll say the mysterious runic inscription is mine.
Fascinating stuff. And here is the last question, Adrian, from Eleanor, which I'm sure must be in the mind of just about anybody who has listened to you all speaking tonight, which is, when will the hoard be on display again?
Yeah, so if you saw some of the big announcements last week, we showed some of Mary's handiwork, the vessel kind of unwrapped with some of the textile still adhering to it because they're so special. This sort of unwrapped and stabilized, conserved vessel, the lidded vessel, is going on display for the first time. A lot of people saw the exhibition. They saw the 3D printed replica of the vessel. The actual vessel has never been on display because it's been in the lab for conservation and study this whole time. So it was announced last week, is going to be on display for the first time at the British Museum as part of their fantastic Silk Roads exhibition. And it's going to be on display there to put it into its sort of wider context with other sort of material from along the Silk Roads and the other silver-lidded vessels that were found in Viking hoards that are quite like it. And so that's going to be on display for the first time from the 26th of September until February of next year at the British Museum. As for the rest of it, our research project is still wrapping up. We've done some great new photography. We're still doing the last bits of testing on all the things that we still have down in the lab. And so we are still working on further display plans, which we hope we'll be able to announce certainly by the end of the year.
Great stuff. Well, thank you so much, Adrian. And all of you. I mean, that was just fantastic. I do think we could have listened all night. Huge thanks to Adrian, Mary and Alex, but also to you for joining us and for sharing your excellent questions. National Museums Scotland have asked me to thank everyone who made a donation when booking their ticket for tonight's event. Thank you very much for that. If you enjoy this free programme of events, please consider making a donation. Your support will help protect these remarkable collections and share their stories with the world. Thank you and good evening.